Hello and welcome back. The lecture is on Imperial China, namely the Qin and the Han dynasties, which were the first really to completely unify China and set up. The Qin dynasty didn't last very long, but it sort of set the stage for a longer periods of imperial rule. So the official beginning of Imperial China is dated to 221 BC, and this is when the Qin have conquered all the other six kingdoms and the have named themselves an empire. But sort of arbitrary, given our definition of empire, which is sort of a large territory acquiring state. There had been plenty of those for at least 1,000 years before 221 BC. But the Qin were the first to conquer all the territories. There were seven warring kingdoms you can see here on this map, and 221 dates the year that the Qin conquered, finally conquered all of them and ruled one unified territory. Uh, and the word China, right, is derived from, although it's spelled Qin. So you may have noticed that 221 BC, this is just around the time, right, that Rome had begun to become a sizable empire. And it's interesting to look at the differences and the similarities between these two great empires that were operating simultaneously on right at great distance from each other with not a ton of interaction. There must have been trade of some sort, right, between the two. So first of all, Greece and then later Rome centered on the Mediterranean. So right, seafaring and trade, a huge part of the core of those empires. China certainly was a seafaring people as well, right? They had the Pacific Ocean on their east, but the bulk of the landmass, right, any interaction, among the Chinese people, uh, is plain steppes, kind of rather hilly, and generally difficult to traverse. Very good for defense, not so great for offense. So often, if you look at sort of the military history of China, which we won't into a lot of detail in here, uh, you'll see that the people that could patiently wait out their enemies, right, and defend, retreat strategically, would often end up victorious in combat on the Chinese mainland. Um, there are two main rivers running east-west, so that is a means of travel, and it was important for agriculture. The Yellow River and the Yangtze, but the rivers were difficult to tame. So they would frequently flood. Um, they would wipe out entire villages, wipe out your crop. You know, rivers do flood, and that is part of why they're so fertile in those areas. But sometimes, excuse me, oh, sometimes they flood predictably, right? Like the Nile in Egypt. In China, it was much more difficult to in these rivers, and we'll see that one of the important things that the projects that the Qin took on was ways of mitigating and controlling the river. There's also a bit of a lack of rivers going north-south, right? So um, that makes it difficult to travel by boat to certain areas of the empire or from certain areas to other areas. And again, this made travel difficult. So there was wheat grown mostly in the north, rice mostly in the south. And again, there was certainly lots of opportunity for agriculture, but certain impediments to trade, right, and to travel. So again, it's a little bit arbitrary to call the Qin the beginning of a Chinese empire. You can look on this chart and see that there were dynasties preceding the Qin for, as early as 1700 BC. Um, some of that, the further back you go, history and myth begin to blend a little bit. So we know a bit more about the Qin. But the important part is that empire was in the Chinese imagination, right? They understand They understood what it was. They understood it as a possibility, and they understood the pitfalls. Uh, there's always the danger of fragmentation into the smaller kingdoms, right? As soon as one area sees some opportunity and sort of trying to go it alone and break off, they will often do that. And as we said, uh, the terrain is more easily defended than it is attacked, and so there are often there's success in fragmentation. Um, so it was tough to keep an empire together for any period of time, and we'll see the Qin when did it for about years or so. So Qin Shi Huang was the first empire and the first Chinese empire, at least according, to the way we're approaching it. Pretty interesting guy. We're not getting into a lot of the interesting folklore about him, but I'll just a little bit that wasn't in the reading. So he was crowned king of the Qin before it was an empire at a relatively young age, um, and there was a rumor that he was not actually king's son, right, and that he was in fact the son of a merchant who had formerly been involved with the king's wife, or one of the king's many wives. Maybe the merchant was his real father. It's hard to say. So the merchant class was sort of looked down upon at this time in China, and so it may have just been a way of insulting Qin Shi Huang retrospectively, right, by the later Han rulers, because again, they're not going to rule for very long, and the next empire are the Han. So when they're telling the story, they have an interest in things like, oh, he's the illegitimate son of a merchant or whatever. So take that with a grain of salt. Um, His royal tomb, however, incredible, right? Again, we haven't excavated it for good reason, right? But at least according to the story, um, you may have seen, and I think we'll later on some of these slides, we'll see, uh, excuse me, we'll see the terracotta soldiers. You may be familiar with those or have seen pictures of them. Things like that filled the tomb, right? There was an entire model of the imperial city with mechanically flowing rivers and lakes uh, filled with mercury, right, which is a metal that's liquid at room temperature, right? So it's flowing around this model. It was also booby trapped, right? So that and then the engineers that designed these booby traps were buried in the tomb. Like they closed up the tomb. They said, well, we can't let the secrets of the booby traps out, so everyone who worked on it has to be sealed up in the tomb. His wives were also sealed up in the tomb because they thought, well, it's not proper, if they should bear children with other people or things like that. So it hasn't been excavated because right, if these stories are true, uh, if you as soon as you crack open the tomb, this mercury is going to sort of vaporize and toxic cloud would be emitted. Um, but there has been sort of tests of the soil around the area, and there is sort of unusually high levels of mercury. So it's entirely possible that some of these fantastical stories about the tomb are true, but we just haven't figured out a way to get into it without dying, which was his original intention. So again, the Qin Empire only lasted 15 years, but it did begin this period of successive empires that lasted until 1911. So the right, the Chinese empires outlasted uh, certainly the Western Roman Empire, even the Eastern Roman Empire, which lasted till the 1400s. Um, so certainly a long-lasting empire. Um, so all these Chinese empires would, they'd coalesce, they'd try to keep the empire together against this natural tendency towards fragmentation, and the tool for doing that was, as always, intermediaries, right? So in Rome, you had the praetors. In Chinese empires, you had officials, right, that were sent to the different territories and or co-opted from locals and in an attempt to keep taxes flowing into the center, right? It's a familiar story. So again, some familiar repertoires. So the Qin, however, were uh, a bit more intense about control than the Romans were. The Romans were often happy to be rather laissez-faire about their territories, right? As long as the taxes were flowing, territories could pretty much run themselves. Jin were not like this. Um, the Jin tried to maintain a monopoly on weaponry. So if you are not right in the military, your swords and were confiscated, melted down. Uh, it's hard to imagine that this would be entirely successful, right? To find every sword in the empire and to melt it down, but at least that was the attempt. Um, they eliminated the traditional nobility, sounds familiar to the Greek reforms, right, of Solon and Cleisthenes, getting rid of the old aristocracy, and Rome did it as well, right? Or at least, yeah, limiting the power of the tribes, creating new ways for advancement and enrichment for people, and a new path to power in attempt to sort of break down the old ways. And there was a meritocratic system, right? So we see over and over that opportunities for advancement for people that were not in the highest echelons, right, seems to be important for stability. And as soon as that starts to break down, as it did in the Roman Empire, then you start to have trouble. But by giving power to anybody, right, be they old aristocrats or new people that have risen through this meritocratic system, there's always the possibility of fragmentation. So it helps, but it's not foolproof. Another problem that plagued the Chinese and also plagued Rome, and has really been a problem as old as civilization, is nomads, right? So the Asian steppes, in particular, have been home to uh, horse riding nomads, right? And they're tend to be excellent warriors, very fast. Uh, what they've done throughout history, from the days of like the 3,000 to 4,000 BC uh, in the Middle East and such, you have this from the beginning of agriculture, right? You start to have a settled town, you're farming wheat or whatever, relatively peaceful life. Um, and a group of nomads can always swoop in on horseback, right, with their military prowess, because this is what they do for a living, wreak havoc, right? Just take whatever they want from the village, kill whoever they want, and then as soon as they came, they're gone on horseback again. And frequent raids were often the scourge of settled agricultural peoples. You see it in China, you see it in the Middle East. We will see when we watch the film Apocalypto in Mexico, right, around 1500 AD, and in the Mayan people, right, there's a hunter-gatherer village that is right swooped down, not on horseback, but raiding. Uh, this was part of the one of the things that would be nice about being associated with an empire like the Romans, is that you have some degree of protection against this. If you're a village on your own, you're less protected. But on the borders, even within the Chinese Empire, uh, they had to constantly be on their guard against these raiders, just as the Romans did against the Gauls, and the Goths, the Ostrogoths. And so walls were a part of the defense of empires, right, from early days. We're not talking about the Great Wall of China was exactly that, right, trying to keep the raiders out, the nomads out. The Qin built a wall, but it was made of earth, not the Great Wall that we are familiar with, but similar technique, similar purpose. Often not so much to keep them out because they could, figure out ways to get over it, but more to funnel them at least to defensible points. But this interaction with the nomads was also uh, helpful to the empire, so that they obviously learned a lot of military technique, and warfare on horseback was a primary form of combat in Imperial China as well through that period. The nomads were traders as well, so as much as they, you know, uh, were violent and practiced warfare on people, they also were happy to trade with people as well, and or were happy to be bought off, right? If in lieu of attacking you. So there was the interaction was not always negative, and much of the innovations in metallurgy and weapon systems the Imperial Chinese they picked up from these. And this picture is actually a modern um, practicing, still some of these traditional techniques that would be not so different from what was going on in 200 BC. So, in addition to appointing intermediaries, right, that were hopefully loyal to the empire and didn't splinter off, uh, they tried the emperors, cultivate loyalty among the peasantry as well. You always do have to keep, right, the lower classes happy. So, local farmers were given land grants. Again, we saw a similar uh, attempt at strategy in towards the end of the Roman Empire when they're having trouble, right, keeping it granted land to soldiers as a means of paying them. Here, land grants were given to farmers, right? Um, the grants didn't include citizenship, but it was often enough to create a certain loyalty. And then it also was a means, right, to tax the produce of those lands, and that was a means of enriching the empire. Um, Part of the deal, if you got a land grant, was you had to serve in the military, so there was also sorts of soldiers. So, right, because in their imagination and in their history and in their memory, the fragmentation of the empire is always a concern. There was a huge system of surveillance, data collection, and then analysis of that data. So they kept data on the age, sex, health, and production of, in principle, all of their citizens, right? Uh, there was standardization of things like money. So prior to the Qin, the money was these blade coins you see in the upper central part there. So it's literally like a knife, shaped like a knife. It's not clear why uh, that was the popular form of currency. So they did away with those and started the form of currency that's probably most familiar to you as a Chinese coin, which is like round with the square hole in the middle. Weights and measures all standardized, which is part of the intellectual work of running an empire is where they standardize I think I'll this later, they standardize the axle widths of carts so that on a dirt road you're in these ruts, right? Well, everyone could ride in the same rut. Uh, all techniques of keeping right the empire together, cohesive. So the Chinese empires were not republics like Rome or Greece, even remotely. Um, the emperor was the center of all military, economic, legal, religious power. Right? So the emperor was a kind of divinity, right, as well as uh, the source of all law, right, the commander in chief. But he can't run the whole country by himself. Delegate. So one thing that was done, right, and is also as a means of surveillance, was to make every person, right, even the peasantry, an enforcer of the law. Everyone was a kind of cop. And this was a way also to keep eyes on his intermediaries, right? So you could, as a peasant, still sort of enforce the law on someone that was higher above you in the hierarchy, right? So snitch, everyone was encouraged to snitch, right? And if you didn't, you could be punished, right? Um, People who were snitched on and caught doing something that the emperor disliked were punished, and punishments were quite harsh. Here we see a person having their foot sawn off, right? That kind of thing, right? Your family could be punished harshly. Not reporting a crime would be punished. So it was a fairly intense sort of surveillance state. Uh, Reminds you of sort of Soviet era Russia, that sort of thing. So, oh, as I mentioned, right? So, you know, trade and taxation, this is the lifeblood of an empire, right? Money needs to keep flowing in, and trade needs to be growing and growing. And so the currency standardization was part of that. The standardizing the axle widths, right, was part of that. Roads were built and extended, often by compulsory labor, like convicts, right? So again, the surveillance state, all of the people that are getting punished, part the punishment might be forced labor, and you could work on these public works. Canals were built to extend the reach of the river systems and expand the ability to travel by river, um, and also to tame the river and build these levees to back. So this attempt to surveil the entire citizenry in 200 BC is like pretty wild, right? We can sort of conceive of it now with all of the information technology we have, but imagine how it was happening back then when the fastest they could go was on horseback, and more likely on a sort of horse and a cart. So all this information needed to flow in and be analyzed and collated. The taxes need to flow in. Again, right, there's no bank transfers, right, via wire or via internet. So, right, coins or precious metals or other valuables have to be carted in with a horse. Um, so it's an enormous undertaking for a civilization at this level of technology, but they were to a large degree successful. So taxes would differ depending on what your social role was. Uh, so peasants, right, paid a tax on their produce, and there was a taxes on people, right? So each person if you had a family of five, you paid a certain tax. If you had a family of three, you paid a certain tax. If you owned slaves, yes, they owned slaves in China too. So far, every empire we've encountered has slaves. Uh, we paid slaves. If you were a merchant, you paid a higher tax rate than others. If you had more than one adult male in your household, you paid an extra tax. So this was sort of an encouragement to break off and do create nuclear families with a father and however many. Um, all adult males had to military and owed a certain amount of labor and service to the empire, working on these public works and so on. So, and then a huge workforce was required to collect all these taxes and do all the surveillance and data analysis and things like that. So, an enormous undertaking and an enormous number of people. So, I think this comes up later, but I'll mention it now. When they talk about warfare in this time, the sizes of the armies that they describe are like 300,000 people, 600,000 people. You compare this to the Rome, right? One of the sort of biggest battles would be like 80,000, right, at most. So, it's not entirely clear whether some historian is fudging the numbers, adding a zero somewhere to try to make, things seem more glorious. Uh, but it does seem that everything is on a larger scale. So even after conquering the other six kingdoms, there are still people beyond the bounds, right, of those kingdoms, and so the Jin were still always at war against these nomads on the frontiers, and the big projects they were undertaking, right, to try to unify the empire, tame the rivers, and so on, were very expensive, right? So again, hundreds of thousands are the numbers thrown out in our sources on the size of the armies and the work gangs. Um, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But huge, expensive, and sort of energy and finance draining undertakings going on. Uh, Meanwhile, these reforms, right, that did away with the old nobility and had this heavy scrutiny on people and these heavy punishments made people with a little money that were used to better treatment pretty upset, right? And those tend to be the types of people that could raise an army, right? They got the cash to throw around, and so there was eventually a civil war, and this weakened the empire, and the Han conquered them. So 202 BC. So not a long dynasty at all, but notable for unifying for the first time. So The Han dynasty, they stepped back a bit from the extreme centralization that the Qin were trying to accomplish, right? They recognized that part of the reason for the Qin's downfall was the sort of revolt of the elite classes, so they gave a little more authority to the aristocrats, and it did give them a longer reign, or may have been part of the reason that the Han lasted longer, but also, right, the more power the aristocrats have, right, the more they're going to get ideas about going in on their own or wanting to take power. Confucianism, right, sort of became uh, Confucius had been around centuries earlier, but his teachings started to gain popularity in the Han Dynasty, and his philosophy was very much focused on right your social role and the way you should live is according to your social role in this sort of hierarchy. And you could see how that sort of philosophy might uh, breed stability, might want to be encouraged by a dynasty that's interested in stability. Everyone has their place, right, in the fabric of society, and uh, but Confucianism was not like the state religion or anything, and anything like the way the Romans eventually adopted Christianity. There was uh, Taoism going on, Buddhism going on. There was ancestor worship as well. So there was Buddhism was kind of new on the scene at the time, actually. So Buddha was around 300 BC, something like that. So it's still pluralistic in a religious sense. But the Han did they gave a little more power to the aristocrats, but they did preserve this uh, meritocratic system of advancement, and they even set up a whole educational system for government service and for government bureaucrats. So the Xiongnu, so and pardon me, I'm doing my best to pronounce the Chinese well. If any of you speak Chinese better than I do, which is almost everyone, uh, apologies if I make a mistake. So as we said, at every point in Chinese history, right, even when you conquer the other six kingdoms, there's always pressure from these nomadic people on the borders. Um, and so when the seven kingdoms become a single empire, well, now that these nomads are the only enemy, but it's costly to be at perpetual war, right, with the nomads constantly pecking at your borders. So we talked about the Great Wall, right, which was designed to sort of funnel them to predictable areas where you could defend. But finally, in the Han Empire, a formal settlement was achieved with the Xiongnu, and the wall became the official boundary of China. Now, how long can a treaty last with a sort of loosely affiliated set of nomads? Um, right, their name for those nomads was singular, but they were very diverse, and the right power structure was pretty loose. So you made a truce with somebody, but it's not clear that it's going to last that long when somebody else gets the idea that maybe they'd swoop in and take a little money out from their neighboring empire. So truce didn't last forever, uh, but it did some sort of intellectual work of setting up this clear dichotomy, right, between the Chinese Empire and right the people outside. I want to say barbarians, which wasn't a Chinese word or concept, but it's something like that, right? So even if the settlement and the truce didn't last long, we had this long-lasting idea of them and us. So you'll recall, right, that every person, citizen or not, right, even if you were a peasant that just got a land grant but wasn't a citizen, you owed military service. Certainly, all the citizens owed military service. The problem was the occasional people that are involved in occasional military service, but most of the time are just farmers, are not the best soldiers. Right? And these nomads are incredible soldiers, right? So they really this sort of setup for the army was not really a match for the nomads. Also, you had the ability to buy your way out of military service. This sort of thing happens. I don't know if you've watched like Lincoln or anything about the Civil War, I mean, this even the Civil War in the United States, you could buy your way out of military service, right? Forever. So started using those fees to hire professional soldiers, often just nomads that they would pay to fight other nomads because they knew how to fight nomads because they were nomads. Um, but the amount you had to pay to buy yourself out of military service could sometimes ruin you financially, right? It was a steep fee. So there began to be some significant unrest about that. And having peasants that are unhappy with the empire on the borders of the empire is not great for national security. So ultimately, the Han ended universal military service in 32 AD, and populations that seemed on the borders and seemed to be upset, they would just relocate the whole village, right, in order to try to prevent what they saw coming, which was collaboration with the nomads and potential, right, lost territory and problems for the empire. So eventually the Han lost control and it once again fragmented into warring factions. There was actually a centuries-long period after the Han where there wasn't an empire. Um, then finally, in the 200s AD, another empire formed under the Sui, and there were sort of alternating periods of empire fragmentation, lasting up until the fall of the Qing Empire in 1911. So, um, again, not a single long-lasting empire like, say, the Eastern Roman Empire, but what we call the imperial period lasted quite long. So you might ask yourself, how did, right? So you look at the Western Roman Empire, and there's this incredible rise, you know, and then in around 400 AD, a fall, disintegration, and that's pretty much it. The Eastern Roman Empire hangs on, but it's like a big hump, right? The Chinese were like, you have a dynasty and then fragmentation, dynasty fragmentation, dynasty fragmentation. They were always able to repeatedly reconstitute themselves. So it's interesting to ask, why do we see that pattern with the Chinese as opposed to the Romans? I'm not giving you the answer to that, right? But I try to point out paper topics when I can. Um, that we've heard some similarities and some differences between the Roman and Chinese empires. Again, the fact that they're both large, both operating at roughly the same time, um, makes it sort of tantalizing to want to analyze the two, right? The similar levels of technological advancement and so on. So, I mean, this seems to be ripe territory for an interesting term paper. If you want to try to explain something about why, right, the Chinese empires continually reconstituted themselves where Rome did not, um, or some other aspect of like, this interesting comparison that I think there's lots of paper topics out there. Um, we'll see a little bit later. We'll talk more about the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, it's called, and that lasted for another 1,000 years after the Western Roman Empire. Um, so that adds another interesting element to it. And why did that part of the Roman Empire last so long in a single, uh, right, without fragmenting and coming back together? Now we have sort of three different models of empire. What are the differences? Can we isolate any causal factors? So, fun stuff to speculate on. Again, it's just supposed to be fun, and I don't expect in these papers that you will have to do a ton of outside research. Actually, if you were wondering about that, you're welcome to, um, but you're also welcome to just use the sources we give you and do some, critical and maybe even a little speculative thinking. That's perfectly fine. So I will next time.